Welcome to Board Game Binge, the place where we bring you bite-sized, bingeable board game content from across the industry. I'm your host, James Staley, and in this episode, we're chatting with Chris Matthew, founder of Bellows Intent, an indie game publisher who recently funded an age-contrived folklore and pilgrimage on Kickstarter. Chris, welcome to the binge. How you doing, my friend?
Hey James, thanks for having me. I'm doing good. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing fantastic. That was a bit of a mouthful. The name of this game, eh? It's something that it's got a lot of coolness around it. We're going to get into it in a second because we're going to talk about this campaign, and I want to talk about your last one because that kind of feeds into this one as well. But
Sure.
first and foremost, a fellow Canadian, welcome. Always love to have Canadians on the podcast. How you feeling on the West Coast?
Yeah, feeling great. Yeah, I agree. It is always lovely to connect with fellow Canadians working in the tabletop space because, I mean, there are some of us, but sometimes it feels like we can be few and far between. So really happy to chat with you
I
today.
would totally agree with that. You know, you often feel like you're kind of isolated, right? Like in your area, it's like, oh, am I kind of the only guy in this industry? And then we start kind of poking around, and I don't know if it's because Canadians are humble by nature, but there is actually quite a large contingent of publishers, game developers, and so forth up here that have done some pretty big things. So it's cool, and it's a high five for Canada. So you are on the West Coast. You've been there for how long? Has this been kind of your whole life, or did you move there, or how did you get to the West Coast?
No, I was born and raised here. I did a few spells away from Vancouver, in Montreal for 5 years and in Germany for a year. But otherwise, this is home.
Oh wow! And now is game I guess publishing your day job, or do you have another job and this is kind of your side gig, or how are you kind of set up?
I spend most of my time on this. I would say it's not full time. I do some stay-at-home dad stuff too,
Oh, nice.
which is fun. But yeah, most of my creative energy I try to put into tabletop games.
Now I was reading somewhere that you used to work for Panda. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. Panda Game Manufacturing. I worked there for 11 years
And how did you
before
get
I
into that? Like, how did you get to Panda Game Manufacturer? Like, where did like, was it straight out of school, or what was the journey that got you to Panda Game Manufacturing?
Yeah, it was straight out of school.
Oh wow.
Now, unfortunately for the viewers, I'm not sure that my story is one that's very transferable. One that I think a lot of people in tabletop, the way that they get into it is kind of a unique path, and that's true of me. So the founder of Panda Game Manufacturing, a man named Michael Lee, a good friend, he went to university here in Vancouver as well at the University of British Columbia.
Hmm.
And he then left and went on with his career and started Panda at some point. And they got to a point where they were looking for just some part-time help to deal with a phenomenon that was new at the time, which was independent publishers trying to fund games on Kickstarter.
Yeah.
And they were at that point in time getting a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of newcomers to the space who were interested in getting their games made and had no idea how manufacturing worked. They were looking to bring on just some part-time help at the time, and they put a posting up. So by they, I mean Michael and his brother Richard, who had joined at that point as well. They put a posting up in the university job board, and it spoke to me on many levels. It was like a young and growing company. They were really passionate about entrepreneurship, which I was and still am as well. And it was in the tabletop game space, which is something that had been near and dear to me since I was a kid. They were both hockey players too, and Canadians, which is something that we could connect over. We ended up playing hockey for a number of seasons, and won a championship and kind of went out on that high and like retired from there. So that was fun too. So that's how I got in. It was from like a random posting on a university job board in the early days of Kickstarter, where people were still trying to figure out a lot of the things that are taken for granted, or taken as common knowledge in the industry today.
That's crazy. And then, like, what were you taking in school? Like, what were your studies?
I was studying business, and with a specialization in accounting, not at all related to tabletop games, but I think the entrepreneurship and business angle and what was going on at Panda at the time was really the connection point there.
What I usually say to everyone is that everything is connected to board games. There is some transferable skill literally in any job. There's something, whether it be project management, whether it be sourcing, creativity, digital arts, you name it. There's usually something, accounting even, right? Like there's something in every job you can pull over. So, having kind of a business kind of lead into that is probably a good leg up in terms of the entrepreneurial side. And game publishing is a business, right? That's, you're running the business side of the industry in addition to designing and things like that. What made you then leave Panda, or when did you leave Panda, or when did that exit occur?
I left a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, two and a half, 2022, 2023.
Mm,
I could have stayed there for a lot longer, and been extremely happy. It's a lovely place to be,
sure.
with one of the best teams that I've ever come across, fulfilling a mission that I think is extremely worthwhile and can identify with. For myself, I had been there for 11 years and I just mostly wanted to try something new. So it was really just a pull to try to experiment with some ideas in tabletop that I thought might be fun for myself and for players,
Yeah.
rather than anything pushing me from there. It's an awesome place.
Yeah. And then was this idea of creating your own game, is this something you had been working on for a while prior to your leave? Or was it kind of like, okay, I'm going to leave and now let me go figure out how to do a game? Like, how did that happen?
No, I think I had been working on a few ideas for a
Mm.
while. I mean, my advice would generally be to try to figure out what your next move is before you leave what you're currently doing, if that's kind of what's your primary source of income.
Yeah, no
Um,
kidding.
so I'd been working on this on my first game, An Age Contrived, for a while, and I had been uh, like developing the game and visual assets for it, but also getting feedback on it to try to determine like, oh, well, is this going to be viable if this is what I try to found a studio with and launch with? I mean, you have to launch with the first title, right? So
Yeah.
if I launch with this one, like, do I think that there's a path to success that way? And I was seeing enough indicators that I felt comfortable that that would be the case.
Yeah, I think that first campaign did like 400,000 or just over 400,000 on Kickstarter, and then that doesn't even include what you did in your late pledges and things like that, and pledge managers. But I mean that's quite an accomplishment for your first game. Did you have that? Did you kind of leave then go do that, or did you have the support of that team kind of while you're getting that off the ground to make sure you were going to kind of land on steady legs?
Well, I had, I mean, Panda as a manufacturing company, I had a lot of manufacturing support for
Sure.
when any sampling and prototyping that I needed to do in advance of the campaign. But that is largely a post-campaign activity, right? Like,
Yeah.
unless you can fund, you're not having anything manufactured. So, so getting the game funded was no, that was entirely my responsibility. I mean, support from, I mean, to say that, like, to take sole credit for that would not be accurate at all, right? As you know, and like
Oh,
as
for sure.
you
Yeah.
provide to your viewers, like, there's so many people out there who make it their mission to educate people who are interested in the tabletop space of how to go about finding a path to success. And I benefited from a lot of the work that so many people, such as yourself, have done in that respect.
What I was thinking is more along the lines of like, did you leave and then go do the campaign? Because that's risk, right? It's like, okay, I'm leaving income at like my career now going, and some people do that, right? And they go and take a leap of faith and say, I'm going all in on this game and this new opportunity, and I'm gonna make it work, which has got a lot of risk around it because it's not always going to work, right? And in fact, the odds are stacked against you in most cases on your first game. What was it for you? Was it a full separation, or was it kind of you still had one foot in the door just in case, or kind of what was your?
I did do that. Yeah, I did make that move. And that is something that that's one aspect of many that I respect about Panda is, unlike some manufacturers in the industry, they have a no internal publishing policy.
Mm,
And the reason for that is so that their own team is not competing with their client base,
got
right?
it.
And even though I'm sure that could work, I'm sure there are ways that that could work where that's not the case, um, and there's no conflict of interest. They are totally correctly, I believe, concerned about the perception of a conflict of interest, right? And whether that can exist.
Yeah.
So if I was going to go off and publish a game, it was not really an option that I would also be on the Panda team trying to help other people get their games manufactured
Yeah.
and then have mine
That makes sense. I had worked with a
coming up
manufacturer
at the same time.
at one
Again,
at
like
one point that had been working on their own internal game. They decided to get into their own kind of publishing house, so to speak, and while they're working on my campaign, and it was you could see the not necessarily direct competition, but the distraction, right? Because they only have so much resources, so much time in the day, and if they're allocating half of that to their own internal stuff, doesn't feel very good if you've hired them for your services and you're feeling you're having to compete for their time. I guess it's kind of along those lines, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the worst case scenario would be that, like, let's say that your manufacturer and you each have a booth at Gen Con, and you both have a Gen Con release slated, right?
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, your games don't make it to the show, which happens, every year there's a publisher or two or more that don't have their games show up, and theirs do. There could always be that question of like, well, could you have done more on my project at the expense of your own? I think that's the sort of conflict of interest that, as a manufacturer, you really need to avoid, or really as any sort of platform that's serving, a very client base. You need to be wary of competing with your clients. Yeah.
That's fair. I had worked in the supplements industry for quite some time, and I had seen that actually with a team we had worked with, where they literally had that at a trade show. They had their stuff kind of up front, prominently displayed on their table, and then the people who had actually paid for them to be in the show were kind of down in the corner behind them and kind of off to the side. And it's like, whoa, that's not cool, right? And I get that. So good for you to take that risk, because that's a huge risk to say, you know what, I'm out of the sandbox now, and I'm gonna go and take a shot at this. And I think with your experience probably at Panda, you had a good sense as to the success, what would be your success, the factors you need for success on this campaign, right? So I think you probably had more of a leg up maybe than other people coming in blind into the first campaign. Would that be fair to say?
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah.
Just, I mean, through the course of my time there, I got to work with and speak with many people who had found success in this sort of journey before. So I felt like there was a pretty good roadmap of some of the key things that you need to do to get there. Not saying that I've, made it by any stretch of the imagination. Like it's a ton of work, and there's still lots of risk involved to publish any new game. So something that I'm still working on and very much learning about as I try to deliver games to players.
Yeah, I was at a meetup last night here in Canada, and it's our local meetup we do where we have friends kind of come out and play games, and it's open to the public. And I had a colleague that was commenting on my current campaign, saying, "Wow, look at all the money you're making." And I'm like, no. That's the revenue that Kickstarter's stating. I'm not making any money right now.
Right.
Like, if you had any idea how much marketing dollars are spent to get, to that lead acquisition, right? So to get somebody from, when you're spending money till they actually make the commitment to pledge, and then that sticks. I mean, it's very expensive. It could be like $20, right? US, a backer, just in marketing dollars by the time that pledge sticks, right? That doesn't include any add-ons, incentives, and things like that you also gave them to get them to kind of jump in on the Kickstarter side. Like there's a lot of risk around it. It's very expensive to kind of hit the any kind of higher levels in campaigns. And, I always say it kind of sucks people's souls, right? The whole Kickstarter process it is a grind, and it is exhausting, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I'm not trying to be grim about the industry, but it's intense.
Yeah, that's one thing that, I mean, I felt like going into the publishing journey, I had my eyes open in some respects from the people who I had worked with.
Yeah.
But in other respects, I did not have as much of an appreciation as I might have for how difficult it would be. And running a Kickstarter campaign itself, and some of the interactions that you can have with backers, I mean, like 95 plus of them are super positive, but there can be some that like, sting as a creator.
Yeah.
Um, that is much more difficult than I had thought it would be.
Yeah, you gotta have a thick skin for sure. With Age Contrived, this is or an Age Contrived, I guess I would say. Um, going from the first game, which again I would claim as a success, right? $400,000 is not a small number comparative to the average campaign size out there. Like it's much higher, right, than the average campaign. That being said, the decision to go and say, okay, I'm going to do an expansion in this same IP. What led you to that decision?
I think it was more of a decision around how to serve players. Like that was
Hmm.
more of the guiding principle than it was a straight business decision. Um, so, for context for viewers, that campaign for this expansion, Folklore and Pilgrimage, just wrapped up around a month ago at the time of recording, and it raised 140,000 US, which was in line with my expectations. Um, so, I had published the base game in Age Contrived. It released in 2024. And then there was feedback that I received from players on like, oh, I like this aspect of it, but like I want more out of this.
Hmm.
Or like, what about this part? Like, so there was a passionate player base that had feedback that as a creator doing this for the first time, I really wanted to address that. I really wanted to try to serve these players who wanted more in a few different directions. Of course, when you're developing a game as well, I think that ideas bubble up to the surface through the course of development that you are not able to fit into the base game for whatever reason or another, right? Like every game you need to stop somewhere, right? You need to cap the complexity or cap the budget for manufacturing or whatever it is. So there were both ideas that we had in development and desires that we had heard from players that led us, I say us, I mean, there's a few contractors that I work with, but largely myself led me to say, an expansion just to serve those players, even knowing that as an expansion, um, only a subset of base game owners will be interested in that, will
Yeah.
want it. I still wanted to try to close that loop, complete that journey, and try to show that, I mean, as a new studio, I think I try to make decisions that will give people confidence in coming back for future titles, and try to prove like what I'm all about and how I try to take a player first approach. And I thought that by listening to players and trying to deliver on what I was hearing from them, that would be one step in that direction of really trying to serve players rather than just, okay, well, this game is out, like I'm gonna forget about it, like you guys have fun with it. Um, and here's our next thing. I thought just returning it something that, yeah, aligned with those principles, I guess.
That's fair. Reputation is everything in this industry, and um, man, will it ever? It follows you, whether it's good or bad. It is going to follow you to the next campaign, right? And if you can delight people with your delivery and the quality of your game, you're going to have an X number of people on your next campaign that are going to say, "Man, I'm just so happy with how well they did on that prior campaign. I had no choice but to back this game just because I'm in love with what these guys are doing," right? On the flip side, late campaigns that overpromise and underdeliver, you get the same people commenting saying, more firing warning shots saying, hey, be careful. This was my experience on the prior campaign. Not sure you can trust this publisher, right? So it is critical that each and every campaign you give everything you've got to ensure you're delivering the ultimate best for your backers, because they'll remember, and that will carry on to the next campaign.
I couldn't say it any better. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you explain kind of the essence of what this game is about and how to play it for those who haven't heard about An Age Contrived? I mean, the components look super awesome. Let me just throw that out there. It looks cool. But give us kind of the essence of this game and kind of what the typical playing is all about.
Sure, yeah, it's an engine building strategy game for 1 to 5 players. So each player takes on the role of a god in a fantasy pantheon ruling over this mortal world. But as gods in this world, we are only as powerful as the mortals believe we are. So rather than being some, kind of overbearing tyrants, we are actually trying to build up a flourishing mortal civilization, just in a way that the mortals believe in us as gods, because that's going to be what helps us thrive. Ultimately, it is a competitive game, so you are trying to be like the most powerful in the pantheon. Okay, so that's kind of the thematic backdrop of what we're doing. It is an engine building game through and through, so it's driven by this like action selection mechanism that is inspired by some of the great modern classics in the genre. So like Zolkin and Hansa Teutonica. There's some inspiration from Scythe in there as well.
Mm.
There's only a single physical resource in the game that is your energy. They're kind of these Azul style little stones.
Yeah, super
Um,
cool.
yeah, the only other resource that exists is really time. It's a very like tempo centric game. And you're using these energy tokens to like load up in your board, program your actions. Your player board is kind of works like a conveyor belt that moves from left to right. And as your stones move in these tiles, they are going to allow you to perform more and more powerful actions. So you're kind of loading up your board with your pieces and then gradually exhausting them to have some big turns where you take a ton of actions, set off a bunch of combos. So there's a ton of combos that you can build up to as well. Yeah, that's kind of a very high level overview, given that we don't have a copy in front of us, and I can't really like
Yeah, I was
point to
just showing on
specific
screen
pieces.
while you're talking the
I
visuals
see.
because it looks. I mean, again, it looks super cool. That conveyor system is quite clever. Where did that come from? Was that inspired by another game, or is that something you guys had kind of come up with, or where did the conveyor thing come from? Because like I really geek out over mechanisms like this, right? Like actual mechanical things happening on the game and in the board. I mean, in my own game that we just recently delivered, Seas of Venus Lost Contact, is about having like a 4 layer player board where things physically fit inside the board. So anytime I
Wow.
kind of see these kind of pieces that kind of have this kind of very utilitarian function, I just geek out over it. So where did the conveyor concept come from? When was that embedded in the whole concept?
That was the first aspect, like that was what inspired the game. And it was inspired by Zolkin, which is a
Mm,
game that I mentioned, which is a game that has its own amazing components in a set of interlocking gears on the main board. So when you
mm,
turn the central gear, all of the outer ones
yeah.
um, turn as well, right? And I love that game. The question that I asked myself was, well, what if you had these gears, but you gave each person their own personal gear rather than having it in the central board, and that gear was upgradable. That gear like became your engine that you could build, like kind of separate the gear or kind of give different features or different parameters to the gear that you could leverage in different ways. Um, Now, a gear, if you think about it, is kind of like a conveyor belt, or a conveyor belt is kind of like a gear, right?
Mm.
In that it's cyclical, right? Like once something goes past a certain point, it cycles back around. In a gear, it's continuous. In a conveyor belt, you actually have to like, pull it back around, or at least in the mechanism of an H contrived. So that was the inspiration. And then component-wise, since you touch on that in the deluxe version of the game, that conveyor belt, which is your player board, it is made of some sheet metal that interlocks with cardboard. So to make like a really smooth sliding mechanism, the thought process there was like, well, I've got a gear mechanism with cardboard tiles that are sliding, and I could make a dual layered player board, right? But then I've got cardboard edges sliding along cardboard edges. Like
Mm.
there's going to be some potential fraying over time. Like I don't want people's games degrading the more that they play them. So I came up with this component that would allow like a more smooth rail system that also serves the purpose of like keeping everything nicely in place. So you just slide from one side and everything moves along its rail and is
Sorry,
like nicely. So
this rail's made of metal.
yeah. Mhm.
Wow. How like just the sourcing of that alone, like how did you go about sourcing like a metal conveyor system for your game?
Well, that's where some of my background at Panda, I
Mm,
think, came into play, in that I had access to a team in China that would be able to help me with that kind of thing.
and figuring it out.
It,
Yeah.
yeah, it still wasn't easy, but like we still had to go out and find a suitable supplier for that kind of thing and determine in the first place, well, is this even feasible? Is this affordable to put in a board game at all, right?
Yeah.
But I kind of looked at some of the products around me in my own life, and specifically, my wife bought me a like a really simple bed stand from, or like nightstand beside the bed from IKEA that was like this black sheet metal thing. Like I assembled it with some screws, took 5 minutes, and I held the thing in my hands. I was like, dang, this is heavy. And I asked her how much it cost, and she's like, oh, it was like $10. Like I just bought it on a whim. I was like, okay, like, well, if IKEA can do that, like I know IKEA is like a massive company, right? Like they have a
Yeah.
scale that board games will not get to, but I'm pretty sure that this like material and manufacturing process could be applied to a game in some sort of way. So I started exploring the supply chain of it, looking for suppliers and also just the design that goes into sheet metal in this case.
That's crazy. That is crazy. With this game, are you like I know it's been done now for about a month, but are you still taking late pledges, or can people still access this game if they want to get in, like either on the original base game or with this expansion? Or
Yeah, yeah, I've still got late pledges. So I mean, one thing that is nice is Kickstarter's enabling late pledges. Like it's available as a creator at this point. So I've got late pledges that are accessible through Kickstarter, on the original campaign page, and yep, the base game and expansion are both available now there. I think that'll keep going for another maybe 2 months before I need to close it down and lock in manufacturing numbers.
yeah, what is the plan kind of from here? So now you've got kind of two a game plus an expansion in the same kind of IP, same universe. Is it now kind of like is that the basket that you're working within in terms of kind of go forward as a publisher, or do you have other IP working on? Like, kind of what is your plan now going forward, given that this is now your job, right? This is like you're all in. What's the plan from here? Like, how are you guys building this out?
Yeah, An Age Contrived was a title to try to launch a studio and prove that I can execute on some ambitious ideas, which I think is going like I feel pretty good about that. But now that this expansion is funded and I mean, it'll be delivered later this year, but that will kind of largely be on rails. I can turn my attention to getting the next game or two put out in front of the public. So those two games are in development now. I think they'll be ready to show probably by Gen Con this year. I'll have something to show.
Oh wow,
So yeah, I'm trying to build from here and release new games and kind of do the thing that independent game makers all want to do, try to release more. And for myself, it's really about trying to, with new games, find ways to serve players a little bit differently than they might be with other games coming out these days.
is it a plan to launch like a game a year, or and is Kickstarter going to be the platform, or do you see other methods of selling and distributing your games?
For the foreseeable future, I see Kickstarter as the primary way that I'll be able to
Yeah.
fund and distribute games. And yes, about a game a year will be my target from here on out.
Well, that's amazing. Well, for those who want to check this out, and I encourage people to check this out, it looks gorgeous. Like the table presence of this game is insane, and it looks like a whole lot of fun. I'm going to put a link in the show notes, so people can just go to the show notes. There'll be a link there, easily taking to the Kickstarter page. If you want to kind of go on a Kickstarter and just do a search yourself, make sure you put Anne, so A-N, Age Contrived, and that'll take you to the page as well. Bellows Intent as well. If you search them as a manufacturer or as a publisher, that will take you to kind of what everything that's been launched, and people can check it out from there. But man, I am so excited for you. This is what a way to kick off your company. You got to be immensely proud of what you've accomplished so far. And if this is what you've done just out of the gate, Man, I cannot wait to see what you're going to come up with over the next couple of years.
Thanks a lot, James. Really appreciate talking with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
No worries, my friend. You take care. Cheers.
You too.
This has been an episode of the Board Game Binge podcast, hosted by James Staley, produced by James Staley and Mike Bruner, with original music by Nick Smith. If you would like to watch these interviews live, simply subscribe to our YouTube channel, Board Game Binge, and you'll get access to live interviews, giveaways, and interesting board game content from across the industry. I can't wait for you to join us. See you next time.